Okay, welcome to the first An Evolving Man podcast. Today I am joined with my good friend Rod. Rod is a counsellor, a psychotherapist, and a certified Healing the Shadow practitioner, and the author of the book Warrior, Magician, Lover, King, a guide to the male archetypes updated for the 21st century. He works with men, women, and mixed groups, both individually and in groups, to heal the wounds of childhood with Marianne Hill. It's a real pleasure and an honour to have you here, Rod.
Thank you very much, Piers. It's great to see you again. And I'm sure your podcast series can be successful, informative, and just broaden people's perspectives. It's a particular pleasure to be on the first one of the series.
A pleasure. Well, it's been a few years that I've kind of been wanting to do this and actually to speak to you about these archetypes, and therefore it just came up for me recently. Okay, it is time, with the challenges and what everyone's going through with the lockdowns and COVID-19, just felt that this was the perfect time to get you into an interview and to speak to you. So thank you for agreeing to join me. So I just wanted to speak a little bit at the beginning. Just my idea with the interview today is, my intention is really I see that men are struggling, with what's going on. And I just was really hoping over these series to offer tools, practices, and teachings just to really help men at this time. And I really feel that because this is so primal in us, these archetypes, I felt this was the perfect place to begin. So I've got a set of questions, and I guess what would be really useful before I begin is just for you to talk a little bit about yourself. No, I've not said that in the questions, but just where your passion for this came from, really, Rod.
Well, thanks, Piers. Yeah, so I'm happy to talk about my background. Yeah. I think it's a story that will be very familiar to a lot of men. My parents are dead now, so I feel I can speak freely about them. But the brief version of the story is that I wasn't parented well or at all by my father. Now, some people will be reacting to that statement, of course, because what does it actually mean not to be parented? I mean, my father was physically present, but in terms of his ability to be a father to me, well, I would say he didn't have any ability to be a father. He was physically present, and that, I suppose, in a way is better than not being physically present at all. So many boys grow up without a father even physically present. But in the end result is more or less the same. It's that essence of masculinity, of becoming who you fully are, of being able to step fully into the masculine computer program, if you like, that's laid down up here, is somehow more difficult because Dad's not around. And there was no other man in my life who could have substituted for him. There's something about the presence of an adult man in adolescent boy's and young man's life, which is essential to turn that computer program on. And if it isn't turned on by that physical presence, that emotional presence of another man, then the man is going to grow up with a sense of something lacking. And that could be a sense of power, a sense of his masculinity, a sense of not knowing how to relate to women, perhaps, maybe not knowing how to relate to other men, fear of masculinity, and a general sort of non-specific sense that there's something not right. And we see this over and over again. You referred to the Mankind Project Rites of Passage weekend. Well, men are called to the Mankind Project because they know there's something wrong. They may not know what it is, but they know that there's something missing. And that's the classic question. How can you know what you don't know? If something's missing and you never had it, but you ought to have had it, how can you know what it is? Well, one short answer is go on a rites of passage weekend with a whole group of men and you'll discover it pretty quickly. and then in some sense that computer program gets turned on. So that was my story. Age of 40, realized there was something not going very well in my relationships with women, not feeling powerful and present in the world. And I found the Mankind Project, I was going to say by chance, but I don't believe these kind of things are chance encounters. And since then, everything has changed, including my passion for the work has gone from purely self-interested to bringing this to other people. And I started out working just with men because that was my passion. That was where I came from. And as you said in your introduction, I'm working with women both individually and in groups with Marianne Hill. And that's proving to be extremely rewarding because, of course, the other side of the dynamic here is that when a man isn't in his power, something happens to the women around him. Maybe they don't feel safe, either because he's not fully present or because he's too present. He's kind of aggressive or emotionally abusive or even physically abusive. Maybe the children, maybe a woman doesn't feel if they have children that he's caring for the children in the way that he could or should be, and so on. So, of course, women are inevitably drawn into this work. And in the process of being drawn into that work, we can heal the relationships between men and women. And so things evolve in a way that's good for everybody, and particularly for the wider society, I think.
Thank you. I really hear that. The importance when men do the work, then it affects others, you know, the women in their lives and the children.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you. So just your microphone, if you could just pull it away a little bit.
There we go. That better?
Yeah, that's better. Thank you.
Okay, great.
So I have a set of questions that I'd like to go through. Some come from subscribers, people who've asked on Facebook, some from myself. As I was saying before we started the recording, I've been on this journey into archetypes for a few years, and it's something I'm very passionate about, especially in film. I love watching those good films. And most of the films I watch have these big archetypes in them. I was watching The Hobbit at the weekend. So, you know, the king, the magician, the lover, the warrior. And what I'd really love just to hear as the basic level is just what are the archetypes, please, Rod?
Yeah, sure. I think that's really very simple, Piers. We could go into the history of it with Carl Jung and his work, but in essence, I don't think we need to. And the reason for that is because when you talk about archetypes, people understand them because they resonate. The idea resonates with people, and it's almost like, of course I understand it. You're talking about me. So an archetype is basically a pattern of thinking, feeling, behavior, almost a way of being in the world that's somehow imprinted in the genetic code inside us. And so different people have come up with different numbers of archetypes, but I think Moore and Gillette, who wrote this book, which a lot of people will have seen, heard of, or even read, they wrote that back in 1990. They came up with these 4 archetypes: the king, the warrior, the magician, and the lover. So in simple terms, we could say that the king was the leader. He's the one who stands tall. He's the director of affairs, the leader, the one who ought to know what's the right thing to do in any circumstances. And if you imagine your world as a kingdom, then the king is obviously the person in charge of that. And he's embodying qualities of compassion and heart-centeredness, wisdom, strength, the kind of things that cause people to look up to leaders. And he can be king in the world that's family, business, society, friends, anything that actually you as a man have a responsibility for. And the equivalent, of course, for all these archetypes, there's a feminine equivalent, with a slightly different emphasis, perhaps, So for women, that would be the queen archetype, maybe the queen, the leader of her world. And then warrior, well, a controversial name, and it was probably all right in 1990, but I think as time has gone by, it's become less acceptable. So we got different names for warrior. We could call it the action taker. And it's about the part of you that goes out into the world and gets things done. Now, what does that mean? Well, it can mean work, obviously, and for men, that's very important. It's part of most men's identity. But it means much more than actually work. It's actually the energy that gets you out of bed in the morning. It's the energy that allows you to be assertive in the world. It's the energy that allows you to get what you want in the world. The energy that allows you to set boundaries, whether that's boundaries with your family, your wife, your partner, your children, work colleagues. It's the part of you that gives you the ability to say, hang on a minute, that's not okay with me. Just stop right there. So boundary setting. And then, of course, it's the energy of assertiveness. That's not okay with me. What I want is this. And then beyond that, of course, it's the energy of anger. Just get right out of my space. That's enough. And beyond anger, of course, we move into other things like aggression. And of course, yes, in biological terms, you could use the word warrior as underpinning that male urge to hunt, to kill, something that probably, well, almost certainly, once upon a time was very necessary for the survival of the species. And of course, you know, there might be an aspect of that historic drive coming out in men's behavior today in certain circumstances that's not so good for us or women or children or the world at large. Anyway, we'll come back to that, I'm sure. Third archetype, the magician. Well, we could call this the thinker. It's the part of you that's responsible for working things out, finding solutions to problems, coming up with creative ideas. Intuition is part of the magician's world of activity. And also this kind of, Maureen Gillette framed it very much in a kind of ritual, ceremonial role. You know, the shaman, the witch doctor, the wizard, the priestess, a connection with other levels of consciousness, plant medicine ceremonies and so forth, connection with other levels of consciousness. Something about the mysterious unfolding of the unconscious mind. But if you think of it simply as creativity and thinking, you're pretty much on the nail. Okay. And then finally, the lover. Well, it's a bit of a misnomer because, of course, when you say lover, everybody thinks of sex and that kind of relationship that's purely physical. But it's actually the primal archetype in humanity. And you can see it no better than the urge in a baby to connect with its mother initially and then father later on. It's about connection. It's the drive for connection with another human being. And sex is just one of its manifestations. Friendship, relationship, intimacy, baby, child, mother, father connections. They're the first example of it. So, yes, about love and connection, really. So the part of us that drives us with a desire to be part of something bigger than ourselves, if you like, part of a relationship. So yes, and the reason that I think this is a very good model for the human personality is because when I describe those to people, the king, the leader, the warrior, the action taker, the magician, the thinker, and the lover, this part associated with connection, feeling and sensuality as well, people go, oh yeah, okay. And beyond that, of course, it allows you to put the framework of what's wrong with your own, your own life, if you like, in terms of where you're deficient and not so strong and where you're too strong, into a very logical framework. So, for example, just a very simple example of that, a lot of men will be really oriented to the work archetype. I've asked a lot of men over the years, what's more important to you, your relationship or your job? Well, I'll leave you to guess the answers that I get to that question from men. So archetypes can be high or they can be low in terms of how somebody is in the world.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you. That gives me gives people a good idea of what the archetypes are.
Mm.
So thank you. The next question really is, and you've spoken about this a little bit in your explanation of the archetypes, how do they impact our world? Because sometimes I hear the question from people, you know, are they, do they have anything to do with my life? And I was just reflecting, I think I was reading something in Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette's book yesterday, and them saying it's not if it's involved, but how this energy is involved. So I guess my question is, how does it impact, especially men? How does it impact men's lives?
Great question. So the first thing is, this book, I have great respect for it because it was the first representation of this entire model that has so many practical uses. But it is out of date, in my judgment. I mean, there's a lot of really good information in it. But it was written in 1990, and I think the world's moved on. So when I wrote this, which has a similar but slightly different title, my intention was twofold. It was to bring Moore and Gillette's description of the archetypes and how they play out in society up to date. And it was to also add in a little bit more information about how men might start to approach any imbalance in their own archetypes. So by imbalance, we could mean that an archetype is too strong or it's too low. And so we've already mentioned that question of, well, what's more important to you, Fred? Is it your job or your relationship? Is it your children or your job? That's when the warrior could be considered to be a bit too high, where it's consuming a man's world. Now, in a way, the problem with that example is that although it's very simple to describe, and lots of people will identify with it, the problem is, I think it feeds into the basic nature of how a man's genetically programmed to go out and do something, to hunt, if you like. Even if the hunting is for the pay packet, there's a sort of level of satisfaction in that, which can become all-consuming. So if the warrior archetype is what we would call inflates, in other words, grows too big, then where is there room for the lover and connection and sensuality and love? Where's room for the thinking, the magician, and where's room for the sovereign who might be able to stand up, were he allowed the space, and say, whoa, just slow down here. Just look at your priorities. Let's get things back in balance. Equally, of course, I mentioned the word inflate there. That's just one example of when something becomes too big, but things can go wrong when archetypes become inflated. Inflation just doesn't mean occupying a big proportion of somebody's life, like work is 75% of a man's interest. It can mean it's inflated in an unhealthy way. And there we'd come across things like aggression, we'd come across bullying, we'd come across abuse of one kind or another. So when you say, how does an archetype impact the world? I think there's several ways that can happen. It becomes too predominant. It inflates in an unhealthy way. And then just to complete the warrior example, if the warrior deflates, then that means somebody might not be able to stand up for themselves. Might not be able to say, no, hang on, that's not right for me. Might not be able to express what they want. Might become a coward. Well, that's quite an emotive word. And it isn't really cowardice. It's just a quality of the personality that means somebody can't stand up for themselves. Now, of course, those things impact both the individual and the world. The bully, a lot of people bullied at school, for example. A lot of people bullied in the workplace. That's become a very current theme. A lot of people whose warrior isn't strong enough will feel the impact of that and know how that impacts them. And you might say, well, that's on a local level. But when you look at the sovereign archetype, for instance, we get in a completely different dynamic here. well, I was talking earlier about sovereign, king, queen, representing the leadership in each of us, in family life, in social life, in business, and that's true. But take that up to the world stage and look at the level of leadership that we have generally around the world today. In political, I mean specifically political leadership. And then I think you really begin to get a clear vision of how failure or inflation or deflation or imbalance in the archetypes can impact a much bigger section of society, in fact, can impact the whole world. I'm not going to name any names because I don't want to be overly controversial. But if a leader, a political leader, is inflated, that means basically he's not in his sovereign and balanced form. He's not seeing things with true perspective. He might become a tyrant. It might, the tyrant leader is my way or the highway. I don't want to hear anybody who's got a different point of view to me. I'm going to enforce my will at all costs, and if you don't like it, you're out. And even if my will is the wrong will, I will find people who will support me, the sycophants, the people who will just like to be in the presence of me because I'm a powerful character. So in the end, that can become a self-fulfilling sort of representation of a man's tyranny in the world. Think of Hitler and Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein, and maybe some of today's world leaders as well, particularly those in single-party states, and even in some democracies. Tyranny. There's no counterbalance to the overgrowth of that sovereign. And when that sovereign's imbalanced and it has tremendous power, then what do you get? You get environmental destruction, or rather a lack of environmental protection. You get permission to big business to run rampant with lack of controls. You get protections that have been in place in society withdrawn or circumvented. Kind of protections in terms of social security, in terms of support for vulnerable people, care for the less well-off in society, who a heart-centered leader would be taking care to look after, but the tyrant, essentially concerned with his own self-interest and that of his cronies, is not really in the least bit interested in. So to put that in a more simple way, I'd say that a lot of the problems the world faces today is because we don't have adult, mature, grown-up, fulfilled sovereigns running the countries of the world. We have people who are not up to the job, who frankly are inadequate because they don't have enough sovereign energy.
Thank you.
Now, people will either agree with that or not, but it's my view that sovereign energy is the one that's most lacking in the world today.
That's kind of my next question, really, is to do with that. Is Moore and Gillette in their book in 1990 talk about, they felt that it was the lover archetype which was imbalanced. And you mentioned in your book about the king archetype being imbalanced, and you're just kind of, is that what you're seeing now? And are you seeing a shift from 1990, or do you feel that's always kind of been the case?
No, I think there was a shift, and those of us old enough to remember the phenomenon of the new man might recall how there was a kind of backlash against traditional, yeah, I suppose traditional is the word, male roles. Go off to work, get the pay packet, come home. That was the end of a man's responsibility. There wasn't much sensitivity, much connection, much love, much sensuousness, sensuality. It was quite a, I'm thinking particularly of things like coal mining communities, shipbuilding, steel making, heavy industrial bases of employment, particularly in Britain, and I think it's similar in America, that really created a certain kind of man and a certain kind of community, which were very warrior-oriented. So yes, I'm sure that Moore and Gillette were onto something in the 1990s, but they were writing at the tail end of a phenomenon where that was kind of dying out already. Heavy industry was being exported to the Far East because labour was cheap. And in the wake of that, I think what emerged was this phenomenon called the new man, who was going to be sensitive and caring and do the housework and look after the children and change the nappies and change the diapers and all the rest of it. Interestingly enough, the backlash against that, which might have increased the amount of lover energy in men, was that women found they didn't actually want that. What they wanted was a man who was in balance, not imbalanced, but who was in balance in all the archetypes, that he was actually firm in his masculinity, but in a tender, caring, protective way rather than a dominant, bullying way. So Think More and Gillette, to answer your question, we're onto something in 1990, but I think what I said a few minutes ago about the state of the world as we look around now, and this current pandemic does seem to suggest what we're lacking is sovereign energy, sovereign leadership, people who are wise, can take control, can lead from the heart, have people's respect, and thereby have authority to lead. The given authority of the people to a sovereign who's fit to lead, whether that's Prime Minister, President, King, Queen, whatever. And, you know, if you distill that down a little bit lower to the family, you might feel that there were a lot of men who weren't, I'll personalize it, I believe there are quite a lot of men who are not empowered because of their upbringing. They're not empowered to lead the family in the way that families need to be led, particularly around boys and adolescent boys and young men.
So later on, I'd like to go into what are the things we can do as men to access these, because you talk about that really beautifully in your books. I'd like to go into that. I've got a few other questions to lead us into that. Maybe that will flow. My question really is just to do with, you know, you're speaking about these troubled times, the pandemic. How can we harness the energy of the archetypes now during this time? We can see this imbalance. How can we use this rather than, sometimes I think people see it as quite abstract. Yeah. So how can we bring it more embodied?
Well, that's a great question. And my immediate response to that is to think again of the sovereign. Because one of the things about the sovereign is that even when somebody hasn't, well, let's talk about men because that's what I believe I know more about. I think it is different for women's sovereignty because they are born of woman, grow up with women, even in single-parent families. It's usually the woman who's in charge of a single-parent family, caring for a single-parent family. And they're surrounded by that soup of femininity from the day they're born. Whereas boys born of woman have to at some point separate psychologically, emotionally from women. They have to grow up into men, and the rite of passage seems to be some really important element of that separation from the feminine and joining the masculine. And they then have to have a good, sovereign male role model to allow them to step fully into sovereignty. So that sounds, even to me, as I say, it sounds quite despairing. So, well, how can people become good leaders? And there are various answers to that question. But one thing that I think I know about sovereign energy is that it's ready to be tapped at any point in a man's life, even if he hasn't been introduced to it by his father or grandfather or uncle or teachers or rugby coaches or whoever. So the short way in which each and every one of us can access more of our sovereign energy, our leadership potential, I think is by making an intention. And by making an intention, I mean more than making a decision. I mean making a decision with determination and focus and commitment. And so, for example, that decision might be something that comes up quite naturally when people are housebound, isolated, afraid, probably in many cases, that actually, and I think we have seen this, Piers, men and women like, making a decision to do things differently that they haven't done before. Around the town where I live, we've got posters up put up by the council. It says, check on your 5 nearest neighbours. And that's what people seem to be doing. So here's one clue to how to get into a place of sovereign energy, leadership, is to make the decision to do things differently. And that doesn't have to be massive things. It's not about running the country or finding a cure for the virus. It's about being a leader in your own life. Being a leader in your own life. Making simple decisions that improve the quality of your world by choice and intention. And what I think follows on from that is that, you know, if somebody makes the decision, let's say, to check on their 5 neighbours, 5 nearest neighbours, to see how they are, and any of those 5 neighbours, for example, for the sake of this example, happens to want something and they can't get it for themselves, then the warrior can take action. Okay, all right, so Mrs. Smith, you haven't got any groceries. What do you want? I'll go to the supermarket and see what I can get for you. And it's a beautiful example, I think, of the leader, the sovereign, finding out what's required, then giving orders to the warrior to go out and do it. And I suppose I could take the example a bit further, because when the warrior gets to the supermarket, he might discover the shelves are bare, because plenty of people have been there before him in a state of fear. They've bought everything. So he can then apply his magician to working out, if this isn't available, what can I get instead? And if that's not available, what would do instead? What would suit Mrs. Smith, who's depending on me to solve this problem for her? And I agree, these may seem like simple examples, but they're how the system operates. Sovereign makes a decision, warrior carries it out, takes the action necessary. The magician brings in the logic and the thought and the creativity, if there are anything, problems that need to be solved. And then you could say that the lover is doing all of this in a spirit of heart-centered compassion, love perhaps.
Okay, thank you. A question which comes to me, this partly from the men I work with, is to do with what happens when it's not the leader who takes that decision. What if it's the magician or the warrior or the lover?
Great question, and thank you for asking it. Usually when the king's not developed or not on his throne, it's the magician who takes charge most of the time. And if you think about that, there is a sort of logic in that. It's the magician is the thinker, and the next best thing to knowing instinctively from a place of wisdom about what needs to happen is to spend a lot of time thinking about what needs to happen. But the problem with this archetypal energy of magician or thinker is that it can really very easily inflate into this endless circularity of thinking, this kind of spiral of mental activity. And because he hasn't got the line of communication, whatever that means in terms of the computer program with the warrior, it might be a kind of paralysis of thinking, but nothing actually happening. Sometimes the warrior takes charge, particularly if people have been brought up in a very powerful sort of action-oriented family. And then chaos can ensue because the warrior is charging around the place, doing this, that, and the other without the direction of the king, and not listening to the magician who might be going, "Oh, stop, stop, stop. That's not the way to do it." And then, of course, if the lover takes charge, then it might be a case of sitting and meditating for 40 minutes every morning and then spending another hour visualizing the virus dying out, and then 2 hours of phoning friends and making sure that there's a connection. And I'm not mocking this. That sounded a bit cynical to my ears, but I'm not mocking it. It's just the way the lover operates. He wants connection with himself, with spirit, with the world. So in a way, there's a sort of paralysis. There can be a paralysis there as well. I mean, the truth is, hopefully the way I've been talking will give your listeners a picture of this integrated system. A balanced sovereign tells the warrior what to do. Warrior goes and does it. If the sovereign needs problem solving, he consults with his magician. And what might that be? Might go on Google, look up the answer, might talk to people who might know the answer. It's not like there's a conscious sort of intention, oh, I'm going to go into my magician now to find out the answer. It's where you move to and what happens when you've moved that constitutes the energy of the magician. Research it on Google, talk to somebody who knows the answers, sit down and think about it, get a pen and paper out and just make a few notes, see what comes. Okay, that's clear. And then the instructions can be passed over metaphorically to the warrior because he knows then what he's got to do.
Okay, thank you. So you've just mentioned when those are in balance, where the magician's leading, the warrior's leading, or the lover's leading, how do we kind of put that back into the sovereign giving the orders again when we've got that situation?
It's a great question. Thanks for asking. There are many different ways, but of course, in essence, the problem is you have to find out what's caused the sovereign to abdicate. I was doing some work with a chap recently. He won't mind me saying this, I know. And I asked him to close his eyes and just imagine where his king might be. And without a moment's hesitation, he said, oh, he's in the bar, drunk, under the table, on the floor. And I said, well, that's really interesting. So why is your king in the bar, under the table, drunk? And he said, well, because he just feels he can't cope. So here's the first step. Find out what's gone wrong with the sovereign. Why is he not in charge? What's his problem? And generally it comes down to the fact that he never learnt how to do the job. If you think of princes, they generally had a training that lasted, well, a long time, unless the father happened to die. Sometimes happened in English history when the princes were very young, in which case a regent ruled in their place till they were of age to take the throne. So basically, I mean, the princes have a long training. The boy standing along his father, which is pretty much a king-prince relationship, or should be, because the father is the king to the son. He has a long training. He watches his dad, he watches the older men, he watches what goes on in the world around him, and it soaks into him in the ideal situation. So he knows somehow how to be a king. But the problem is, as we've said, there don't seem to be that many balanced kings in the world. So we need to find out, first of all, what's gone wrong. And often it's as simple as the fact there was no father. He just wasn't there physically, or like I said for myself right at the beginning of this interview, physically present but emotionally absent. It might be that father was both physically and emotionally present, but he was a child. He'd never grown up into a mature man emotionally. Might look like a mature man, but with the emotions of a child. So in that situation, it's about gaining the experience and support needed to step out of the shadows and be seen as the sovereign that you are. And also, let's make no bones about it. I mean, sometimes parents don't want their children to grow into full, powerful adults. And whether by design or intention or by accident, they suppress these qualities. While we're talking about the sovereign, there's no better example of that than some of those old English sayings. Children should be seen and not heard. Imagine, you're a boy or a girl, you want to be seen, you want to show the world how competent, how clever, how proud you are of what you've done. You step up to do that, and you're slapped down, not necessarily physically, but, oh, shut up, go away, children should be seen and not heard. Oh, what do you do? You know, this kind of thing that happens to children, even with great parents who are at the end of their tether, and for some parents who have no other way of coping. How do you reverse all of that? Well, there's the perennial question: how do you reverse any of the wounds to any of the shadows? You start doing personal work of one kind or another. You find yourself the company of good men or women or both who will support you in that. And you are right. You mentioned earlier that I put some suggestions about how people could build up the archetypes in here, and that's absolutely true. And what I've come to understand as time has gone by is that this work is better done in the company of other men and women who are seeking the same outcome, because they're supportive and they'll be able to reflect, feedback, help, support, generally be part of the process. Which is not to say that there aren't things you can do on your own. There are plenty of them. But it's easier in a group of like-minded people. So the first thing I'd recommend is that you find yourself a circle to be part of. Either a women's circle if you're woman, men's circle if you're a man, maybe a mixed gender group, but I think it works better at this kind of, when people are developing these energies for the first time, if they sit with their own gender. Sit with a group of men who you trust, who are worthy of your time and attention, and who feel that you are worthy of their time and attention, and just start to share your experience of life and what you want and your intentions. The power of such a simple process is considerable. And what it does, I think, is allow people to be seen, to be heard, and to start to express some of the wounds. When I say wounds, I mean the emotional wounds that they've experienced in life that might not be allowing them, those wounds, like children should be seen and not heard, which might not be allowing them to express their qualities fully.
That's really clear. I'm hearing it's kind of easier in a group. Definitely found that in my own experience. And I think at the present moment, with us being disconnected, I think it's even more so that it is possible to meet online on groups. And I know the Mankind Project are putting together these pies and teas or something. I've forgotten the word for it.
Pie and coffee. Pies and coffee.
Pies and coffee.
I think it's virtual coffee and virtual pies. I think it's a case of you bring your own coffee. But absolutely, it can be done online. It's not the same, of course, as being in the room where you can see and smell and hear and touch somebody, but it's the next best thing, for sure. Okay,
I'll put a link in the description to people who want to connect to a group.
Yeah.
So I have a question from from Facebook for you. So it's along the lines of, with such big forces at play, how do the archetypes, especially the warrior, fit with the idea of peace and love? And he goes on to say, should the warrior be prepared to fight for his families and his communities for humanity's future? Powerful question.
It's a very, very wonderful question. And I think my first answer might sound a little bit like a cop-out, but I don't think it is. I think you have to decide what your level of action in the world needs to be. We're not all activists. I've tried to be an activist for a long time, a political activist, and it really wasn't suited to me and my way of being in the world. But there are people to whom that's a very appropriate way of expressing warrior energy. Horses for courses, as the saying has it. So for some people, warrior energy might be about protecting their family. It might be about putting boundaries in place around what needs to happen, not just now in the time of the pandemic, if that's what it is, but boundaries around what needs to happen when things return to normal, or whatever we have for normal. So what I mean by this is setting appropriate boundaries for children, putting appropriate boundaries around your own behavior, and other members of your family, saying what you want and what you don't want, and also protecting the vulnerable, because although the warrior's got a bit of a bad rap and he's gone out and made war for centuries, the truth is that the warrior has another function, which is to defend the vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And that is absolutely the protection of the vulnerable in society at the moment, including, I might say, the vulnerable young child inside each and every one of us needs protecting. Protecting from his fear, protecting from the verbal or physical assaults of others. Then beyond that, you know, there might be people who feel moved to take a wider role in society, become a political activist, perhaps, or join Extinction Rebellion, for example. That wouldn't suit everybody, but it will suit some people. And what better expression of warrior energy than to fight for a cause that you believe in? And then there might be people who want to go further than that. I heard a story, I can't remember the name of the charity, it was one of the water charities in Africa, of a guy in America who, he wasn't that old, I think he was in his 20s, who woke up one day in the gutter in his lowest point of addiction and took a look at himself and decided he was going to spend the rest of his life fighting to bring clean water to Africa. He had absolutely no assets. And in the, I think, 15 years since he woke up in the gutter, he's raised £300 million and brought water to whole swathes of Africa. So the level of action that you can take in your warrior probably depends on your personality and who you are and what your inclinations are. But I guess it's probably always more than you might think. But don't be too ambitious. Tailor it to what's appropriate for you. Might be protecting yourself, might be protecting your family, might be protecting your town, your village, your society, might be trying to protect the world. It's about finding the right place for you to express that energy. And as for the should in the question, should we all be doing it? I'm not sure I have a clear answer to that. I think perhaps I'd say I don't think we can all do it by virtue of our temperament and our nature and what's possible for us.
Thank you. Thank you for the answer. That makes sense.
But actually, as I say that, I do have one other observation, that I think a lot of people could wake up from the stupor they're in, seduced by Facebook, seduced by the internet, seduced by drink and drugs and distractions, because it soothes their emotional pain. I think a lot of people could wake up from that and put the energy that they invest in Facebook and all the rest of those distractions to some constructive use in the world.
So I have a question. I mean, time-wise, I should have checked this before. How long are you happy to go on till? Because it's coming up to the top of the hour. We've got 8 minutes before.
Well, let's go on till we've answered all the questions, and we'll see if I can answer them perhaps a little bit more concisely.
Okay, thank you. So the question then is just about emotions. So I was reading in your book today, this morning, about emotions, and I've had the same experience. How we deal with them, what type of things over your experiences, in the last 40 years doing this work, what are the things which work? Because you mentioned in your book things like counseling, so that I've had the same experience. It didn't work for me. What are the things you found which really help with this emotional side, rather than using Facebook and things like that? How can we deal with these emotions which are there?
Thanks for the question, Piers. And before I answer that, I'd just like to map out what those difficulties are in each archetype.
Okay, thank you.
If that's all right with you.
Yeah.
Just so we know exactly what we're talking about. So the sovereign, the king wound would be, we've already covered it in passing, something about not being seen or being heard, not being encouraged to step into your power. the consequences of that can be, strangely enough, that inflation I mentioned earlier, that the adult becomes a tyrant, or it can be the opposite, that he becomes an unseen, abdicating king with no voice and no opinion. In the warrior, the balance that we've talked about, action in the world, when it inflates, the warrior can become a bully or a sadist. It's all about action at any cost, no sensitivity, no emotion, just action. And then the opposite side of that is that it can deflate, it can become a victim, a masochist, one who just is walked over by everybody. And another form of the inflation in the warrior is rage, the domestic abuse. So people don't stay in the inflated or deflated generally, they switch between them, depending on circumstance. In the lover, the inflation is the needy, emotional, addicted one who is at root trying to soothe himself or herself with anything, substances, sex, porn, connection with others. Even meditation can be a kind of form of soothing the emotional wound. Anything sensual, anything that gives a nice temporary sense of wellness or goodness to soothe the deep pain inside. And the opposite of that, the deflation for the lover, is the stoic, I'm all right, I don't need anybody, get away from me, I don't want anything to do with this emotional stuff. And then finally the magician, inflation, I think I mentioned briefly, that's that overthinking, very heady. The people that you meet who seem to have a ligature around the neck and work from the neck upwards, almost like there's nothing below it. And that can really kind of lead to dissociation and lack of emotionality and actually sociopathy. That's the right way of pronouncing the word. Disconnection from feeling, disconnection with the people. And then the deflation is the confusion, I just don't know the answer to this question. Don't ask me a question because I won't be able to tell you any of the answers. So we have this whole range of outcomes for each archetype that can result from the emotional wounding. And when you say emotional wounding, that could be all kinds of things. It's any adverse experience in childhood that causes somebody to put away a part of themselves or a part of their behavior. Don't bring your anger in this house. We don't want it in here. What are you crying for? I'll give you something to cry about. People of a certain generation will remember the days when teachers could beat children legally with belts and leather belts and canes and slippers. That was the situation in Britain until surprisingly recently, mid-80s, I think it was finally outlawed. All of these things cause children to become less than who they are. They put their emotions into shadow. What we mean by shadow is just over the shoulder, out of sight, because the world doesn't want it, or my family doesn't want it, or the teachers don't want it. They don't want my spontaneity. They don't want my sexuality. They don't want my anger. They don't want my tears. They don't want my personality to be big and expansive and seen. They don't want my confidence and my willingness to talk loudly and confidently at every opportunity. What they want is a boy, not a girl. So I put my boyness away. They want a girl, not a boy. So I put my girlness away. They want a feisty child, not a quiet one who wants to read books. So I put my feistiness away. They want a child who reads books and is an academic, not a feisty one who wants to go out and run around the meadow. So I put my running around the meadow away. And every time I put something away, I become smaller and smaller and less than. And sometimes when I put it away out of sight, it hurts. And my heart hardens just a little bit more. And then one day I realize there's something seriously wrong with my life 40, 50, 60 years later. And that's the point at which I need to come and seek some help from somebody. So, Counselling is very good for supporting people on a short-term basis. But what I've discovered is that to really get into healing those emotional wounds that come from the I don't want, don't show us, put that away, don't come here with that, don't be that, don't be who you are, be what we want you to be. The way to get that stuff back from wherever it was put, to hold it there, to look at it and to bring it back into self requires work which involves some form of action. Counselling, while it's supportive in the short term, does not cut it. What you need to do is get down and dirty, by which I mean you need to find a way of bringing that stuff out, looking at it and doing something with it. Now, of course, in a way, just living your life does that. For instance, a lot of people have found their sovereignty through doing drama classes and comedy courses and taking part in groups where they Toastmasters, big one, for instance. No better place to be seen and heard than giving a speech in front of a group of people. But you see, the thread is still there. This is about taking action. It's not about sitting in a counsellor's office talking to them for 3 months about your problems. The Warrior Weekend, the NWTA, the Mankind Project, let's call it the Mankind Project Weekend, is very action-based. It allows men to take, let's say, out of shadow from wherever they've put it, many of the parts of themselves that they've hidden away, and try them out for size, like going into a clothes shop and seeing if the suit fits. You know, the men who haven't expressed any anger for 20 years, haven't said boo to a goose, can have the experience of getting angry and seeing what it feels like. The men who've been far too angry, all of that stuff, can get the support of men to calm them down and see what that feels like, so that all of their personality can be brought out and, as I say, looked at and tried on for size. Now, it's a Warrior Weekend, so we know it's mostly focused around that, but there's a heck of a lot of sovereign in there as well. And there's actually quite a lot of lover in there as well, because the whole framework of the weekend is designed to protect people from, is designed for all this work to be done safely, so that that wounded inner child who lives in the lover can begin to feel that he can just poke his head above the parapet once more and look out into the world and see what's going on. And there's great connection between the participants. I mean, you've done the weekend, Piers, you know how intense that connection can be. And some men haven't experienced that since, or maybe ever, actually.
I found that very powerful. You know, I've done lots of personal development work, but just being in a room with 100 men, no women, it was like, wow. And there, you know, that sense that everyone was there staffing, they were in service.
Absolutely.
All of them were paying to be there. And it was like, just, yeah, it felt,
exactly.
Very powerful.
It's a fantastic introduction to the parts of yourself that you put away into shadow. Fantastic introduction to the process of bringing them back and reincorporating them. And of course, beyond workshops like that, there are plenty of other things. You know, plenty of men who are deficient in warrior energy, for instance, get a huge boost and rebalancing by just doing something like martial arts training, fitness training, exercise even, boxing in particular, because that's very, you know, it's kind of very warrior-like, both in action and intention. Lover workshops, you know, a lot of people tell me that they recovered their sensual side by doing tantra work, or by having a female partner who was able to open up to them in love, and obviously for men who are attracted to men, a partner who could open up to them in love, which allows them to feel safe, and so it goes. But you know that in every one of these things, whether it's a circle or it's boxing or it's a workshop or it's a relationship with a partner, there's something active happening. This action is being taken in one way or another. So yes, in the book here, I've got quite a lot of suggestions in each archetype. Let's have a look what I wrote for the warrior. It's slightly embarrassing. I can't remember what suggestions I made, actually.
Tell you, because I've got it in front of me.
Oh, great. Okay.
Well, I've got some of them. So what have we got? I think we've got how to connect to the warrior is make friends with your anger.
Yeah, absolutely.
Second one is control your rage.
Yeah.
Third one is about finding a physical outlet that matches your warrior's needs. So you talk about maybe, like you say, boxing, martial arts. I did a mind map of your book, you see. Well,
oh, great. Thank you. It's good to know it's getting into your computer program, some kind of patch.
Yes, yes. Well, I was thinking, actually, maybe at some point, if people are interested, is we go into more depth into these, maybe do an interview about each of the archetypes.
Yeah, absolutely. That would be a fabulous way forward. I particularly like number 4, get your balls back.
Ah, yes. Yes, that's also in the King one as well, isn't it? That's get your balls back from whoever's taken them.
So for men, the predominant balance, I think, to embody masculinity in a way that feels natural is oriented towards the king-warrior axis. That those are the two energies that I'd see as being predominantly masculine. Now, this might be controversial to some people, but there we go. I don't mind being controversial. The feminine aspect, I suspect, is more predominantly lover and magician. And I think that probably reflects historical roles from our evolutionary times that required men to do certain things and women to do certain things. And the obvious example of that would be going out hunting, which is kind of a very warrior-like activity. But, that is a generalization and a sweeping one at that. Men have been perfectly good child raisers and men have been perfectly good magicians.
Yeah, I guess it makes sense to me. As you said that, like the magician, I see that as a masculine thing. But yet, in the Native American traditions, my wife tells me this often, it was always the men who would go to the grandmothers, the elders, for the wisdom. And I see that, as you speak in your book, the magician's about wisdom, about, having that wise part. So that makes sense. So that's...
And acknowledging, as we say that there will be cultural differences between societies, because how these things are expressed is built on the template of the genetic programming underneath it. And one final thing that I think I'd like to say before we finish is just a brief word about the emotions, the feelings that you mentioned a few minutes ago. For me, the ultimate object of all of this work is to reach a place of joy, or at least consistent happiness. To feel more happy than not, perhaps, is the best way of putting it. And that's the energy of the sovereign. And we call it joy, but happiness is just as good a word. One of the ways to get to that consistent state of happiness is to shed a lot of tears. The energy of the lover, which is all about the child, the lack of connection, the loss of connection throughout life. Each of our losses has a massive amount of grief attached to it. And it's that grief which somehow seems to inhibit the sovereign stepping into his joy. So another piece of action work in the lover is mourning those losses. And in the right setting, you would be surprised how easy it is just to imagine perhaps grandmother. You never shed any tears when she died, for whatever reason. Just talk, assuming she was a loving, kind figure, of course. You might not shed tears if she was not that. Assuming she was a figure in your life that was valuable and you loved, just to imagine her, or to set up a prop that represents her, teddy bear or some childhood toy maybe, and just talk to her all the things that you didn't say until the tears begin to flow. And again, that's the kind of work that's a lot easier to do. There's some energy in a group rather than individually, but it can be done individually. So we've got the joy of the king and the grief of the inner child, the lover. Warrior we tend to associate with anger. I think that's pretty obvious, really. And anger is that hierarchy of energy, from getting out of bed in the morning to stating your needs, to saying no, to being assertive, to being angry because somebody's infringed your rights, through into the inflated, aggressive, rageful, damaging energy. And the magician, oddly enough, is about fear. And the reason it's linked to fear is because fear is an emotion that often requires us to get out of one situation and into another. And sometimes that's an instant fight or flight response. But often it's a threat that's in the air, which is why so many people are experiencing fear because of the virus. It's activating their threat system. It's activating the magician. And the problem here, of course, is that the magician is powerless. The magician has no recourse other than to lock the doors and bolt them and stay indoors. And the sovereigns who could be giving us perhaps better advice about what to do seem to be in a state of confusion and disarray. So we're left with our own magicians going, don't look at anybody. If you pass them, don't look at them. Don't acknowledge them. Don't speak to anyone. Don't do anything risky. Don't go out of doors. Don't go to work. Don't go to the shops. Oh my God, you've got to go to the shops. You've got to go to the shops and panic buy, because if you don't, you won't have any food. So do that as quickly as you can and wrap a scarf around your face. This kind of thing. Very magician, but very much fear-based. And also, I would say, shame. That tends to live in the magician. Well, it's a very quick look at the archetypes. We could talk for days on the subject, Piers. We could.
Yeah, I have notes upon notes upon notes. And
so,
books upon books.
With some shameless self-publicity.
Yes, well, yeah, please. Yeah, how do people get in touch with you? How do they? I know you do workshops, you do emotional healing work, you do one-to-one. Please, where do they find you?
Okay, well, there are two ways. You could buy this book. All the details are in that. It's available from Amazon. Or you could just type my name into Google. I think I'll come up. It's quite an unusual name. I do have a website which has some information on it. But to be honest, the first step for anybody who's beginning to explore the archetypes is to do a magician piece, get the information, discover what needs to happen. And this book, I think, is pretty good. I would say this. Piece, well, I was just saying, getting the book and reading it is a magician piece, isn't it? It's like finding out the information, using the brain power to work out what in here is relevant. I was just going to say, I would say this, wouldn't I? But if you've got a choice of the two, start with this one. It's written for our times, and it's a lot more accessible, I believe. I mean, you might have an opinion, Piers, because I know you've read them both.
Yes.
It's a lot more accessible than the original one. And in addition, and perhaps more importantly, it does offer constructive things that you can do to, like I said, get all those hidden parts of yourself back and reclaim them and just become the person that actually, you would always have been if it hadn't been for the world getting in the way between the day you were born and now.
Yes, I do indeed. I've got a few of them here.
Yeah, absolutely.
That one as well, my own notes. So yeah, I found that it took me quite a long time to really, it's a great book, but it's not that easy to get through. It's a bit like a book I keep studying over and over and over again. What I love about this is I love the pointers that you've got. This is what you do. Step 1 for the warrior. So, the notes I have here in my mind map, it's got the qualities. So, the king rules well, hold projections. So it's just simple. So, and I like that it's a really good starting place. So yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, Piers. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you as always, and I hope it's been useful. And I would love to come back and do more.
Yeah.
Let's see what response it gets first, shall we?
Yeah. Well, yes. Well, after the, I'll press stop this recording in a moment, and then we can maybe talk a little bit more after this.
Okay.
But yes, it'd be lovely to get you back on. Please, if you're watching this and you really, you'd like to hear Rod speak more about the king, the magician, warrior, lover, both aspects, the light and the dark, the shadow and the light, then please do comment below or message me. So I really recommend you go and buy his book. It is brilliant. I've read it. And I really have learnt a lot from reading that, and I loved working with Rod. I've worked with Rod, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, doing some Mankind Project work, and that was a real honour having someone just holding such beautiful space. If you got a chance to attend once the lockdown's over, attend one of his workshops, please go and attend one of them. So it's been an honour.
Thank you, Piers. Farewell for now.
Any last words?
No.
Okay, splendid. Yeah, take care. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.